Hey guys, welcome back to our channel and welcome back to another video. I'm Justin.
I'm Jess.
And today we're really excited. We're going to be showing you part one of making our very first epoxy table. Okay, so step one in making an epoxy table is building the mold. Now, we've watched a lot of videos on YouTube on how to build epoxy tables. The one channel that stuck out to us the most was Blacktail Studios. I encourage you, if you're looking to make an epoxy table, definitely go check out their channel, his channel. I believe it's just one person. The way he does his epoxy tables is excellent. So step one, building the mold. We did a lot of research and tried to find some inspiration for different epoxy table ideas. We wanted something that was pretty simple and easy to do that could potentially be possibly like a side table next to a couch. Found some inspiration online, and we came to the conclusion that maybe a 20 by 20 by 2 inch in depth epoxy table would be sufficient for us. So knowing what our final dimensions were going to be, there's a few things on our list that we're going to need in order to take care of this mold. Number one being something to make the mold with, and what we've seen online that works really well is melamine board. A couple of other things that you're going to need to build this mold. Number one being some type of silicone caulk. Just an all-purpose caulk would be fine. You can find some on Amazon. I'll put a link in the description box below. The second thing is Tyvek tape. And again, you can find this and the caulk even at pretty much any hardware store. So instead of creating a mold that fit those exact dimensions, I think it was smarter for us to make something a little bit bigger to have that wiggle room, and then we could always trim down later on if we needed to. So the final dimensions of the mold was 21 by 21 by 3 inches in depth. Additionally, you'll need some sort of saw. We just use a circular saw to be able to cut this melamine board, and then a track guide as well. So we made the marks on those and did the cuts. And then the edges, well, we've seen this done a couple of different ways. You can either put the edges on top of the board or on the sides of the board. Let's just say hypothetically we put the edges, the sides on top of the board. Well, then the dimensions of that would just be 21 by 21. But we chose to do it on the sides. I think it can go either way. We didn't have any problems with it being on the side, I'll say that. So for the sides, the dimensions for those, we've got 4 pieces we got to cut. 2 of them are going to be 21 inches flush, and that's super easy. And then obviously the other 2, to make up for the difference, is going to have to be just a little bit longer. So we want to accommodate for the thickness of the melamine board, which is 3/4 of an inch. So we'd have 3/4 of an inch on one end and then 3/4 of an inch on the other end. That's 1.5 inches. So we're gonna have to cut 22.5 inches for the other 2 pieces. For the overall height of the side pieces, it was approximately 3 3/4 of an inch. Again, that 3/4 of an inch is gonna be the thickness of the melamine board. And like I said, we're putting the edges on the sides of the table instead of on top of that base. It's going to be on the side of the base. So you've got 3/4 of an inch, and then we also wanted to do about 3 inches of depth to play around with. So we've got plenty of wiggle room to try to get to that 2-inch mark for the final epoxy table. So what I'm going to need for the sides is 4 pieces that are cut at about 3 3/4 of an inch in thickness. And then my length, I'm gonna go ahead and cut them, measure out for 22.5 inches. And then for the other 2 pieces, I'll just take off about 1.5 inches to get that 21-inch length. So we'll make our marks, make our measurements, and we'll get this thing cut. After we've gotten all the pieces cut, we line them up, make sure everything is flush and looks good, and it does. And the next step is going to be adding the Tyvek tape. This was a pretty simple process. We did our best to line up each piece, but it is okay to get some of that overlap as well. And you might think, well, won't there be creases or lines from that tape in the finished product? There will be a little bit, possibly, not much to notice from what we've seen. However, we are going to end up sanding and polishing the bottom anyways, so those little lines will get polished out in the long run. I think the reason for Tyvek tape, at least from what we've seen in other videos and online, is it prevents the resin, the epoxy, from basically sealing itself to the melamine board. And it will make the process of getting the melamine board off of the epoxy table once it dries so much easier. Another thing that you could buy is a mold release, something to just spray inside of the mold and on the Tyvek tape, just to help keep, again, the resin, the epoxy from sticking to the melamine board. I will say we did not use any mold release, and you'll see later on that we had no problems whatsoever getting the table disconnected. I guess that's a spoiler. And after getting all of the cuts and the Tyvek tape, we're gonna assemble this thing. And the easiest way to do that is just pre-drill your holes, and then we just use some exterior wood screws that we had on hand, about maybe 4 or 5 along the sides, just to make sure that this thing stays well put together. Step 2 is gonna be preparing the pieces of wood that's gonna go in the epoxy table. As you know, if you've been around this channel for a while now, we had a massive tree fall in our backyard about a year ago now, and the root ball was sticking up out of the ground, and we saw that and thought, wow, that would look really good as a table if we could just get some of those pieces off. So what we did, just as we were cutting up some of the pieces, I took my chainsaw and cleared out as much of that as I could, and we just kind of sorted through about 10 to 15 pieces to see what would work and what would look really good in the epoxy table. We settled on about 5 or 6 pieces here that we decided would look really good, and began working to chisel out all of the dead wood, and then eventually leveling the pieces with our router. This process did take a little bit more time than actually building the mold, just because we wanted to make sure that we got rid of as much of that dead wood and soft wood as possible, to where we were left with a really solid piece of hard wood. I will also make a note that I wasn't too concerned with making sure that the pieces were super level, at least on the top, because I know that after the table is finished, I'm going to router down the epoxy table as a whole. Moving on to step number 3, it's time to get this resin poured. So what we did is got all of our wood placed in the mold and rearranged them until we got something that we liked and something we thought looked really good. One step that I forgot that should have been done prior to this is sealing the edges with the caulk. I completely forgot to do this. This is a fast drying caulk, but it is recommended, from what I've researched, to at least give it about 24 or so hours for the caulk to dry, just to make sure that none of the epoxy is going to seep out. And as you can see, I'm having to use the caulk on the back side of the table. It's totally fine. I got it all cleaned up, and it worked perfectly fine. So no issues there. We had no leakage whatsoever. After about 24 hours of letting that caulk dry, it was time to apply the shellac. That's the next step. And so what we're gonna do is just put a base layer all around each piece of wood, on the edges, the tops, the bottom. This step will prevent any staining from the epoxy that might spill or splash or drip on top of the wood in places that you might not want it to be.
All right, you guys, quick break from the video, and we're going to tell you about today's sponsor. We are super stoked about this because this is actually our first sponsorship, so it's really exciting. Justin, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, big thank you to Ultra Clear Epoxy for sponsoring this video. Our friends Thomas and John, they were able to hook us up with 1.5 gallons of the resin and epoxy, and even 3 or 4 of these liquid pigments. And this worked perfectly for this project. So make sure you go check them out. We're gonna link what they were able to send to us for this project down in the description box below. They've also got other items for, like, they've got like powder pigment. They also do bar epoxies or a bar resin, if that's what it's called.
Yeah.
So, and we have
plans
to do that.
To use some of that over our countertops. So definitely check them out below in that description box. We cannot recommend this company enough to you guys. Truly, we are so glad with how this table turned out.
Yeah, so thank you guys, and back to the video. This is the part that we were most scared and most overwhelmed, intimidated about, but I'm telling you right now, it was a lot easier than we thought it was going to be. And knowing what we know now, whenever we go to make our next epoxy table, it's going to be so much easier. So based on the dimensions of the table and the overall thickness that we were shooting for, they recommended the 1.5 gallon kit, and that was more than enough for what we were going to need. Now, I would assume, regardless of who you go with for your epoxy needs, more than likely they're going to come with instructions, and ours did as well. It was super helpful. And a couple of things that they noted was just make sure that the surface is clean. And then also another thing is you want to make sure that the table is level. So we had to do a little bit of leveling. As you can see, we've got it on some sawhorses and then a piece of plywood. And then I just used some wood shims up underneath the mold and just took my time to make sure that this thing was perfectly level. So essentially what we were going to need is 2 parts resin to 1 parts hardener. And for us, because of the quart size, the buckets that we were given, we went with the max, and that was 3 quarts of resin and 1.5 quarts of hardener. Additionally, I will say that it's also recommended, and we've seen this done in a lot of other videos, but also some that weren't done, and that's applying a base layer of the epoxy on the wood. We opted out of that, and I think the epoxy table turned out fine. I'll also say that we definitely made this process much more difficult than it really should have been. We were overthinking the process from the beginning, just a little overwhelmed with doing something like this because it was new. It was a little bit easier than we thought it was going to be, even though we were afraid of making mistakes or messing up or whatever the case may be, because it is epoxy and it's kind of permanent. That's just a part of the process. It's a part of the process of being a DIYer or whatever you want to call us. Just figure it out. That's our motto, is just figure it out, and you learn from your mistakes, and then the next time you do it better. After we did a good amount of mixing, it was time to finally pour in the pigment, and we chose to use the liquid pigment, and we just had the color black. We wanted this table to be black, and we think it's going to look great. One thing to take note of is you're going to need more than you think you're going to need. And when you're stirring it and you pour in 4 or 5 drips, you're gonna think, oh, this is enough. It's not, it's definitely not. And we learned that pretty quickly, that we wanted this color to be super thick. We did not want it to be transparent. If you want it to be transparent, by all means, be very conservative with how much of the pigment that you put in there. However, if you don't want it to be transparent, put in a lot of the pigment. And you wanna make sure that you're stirring consistently and trying to get all of that pigment color off of the edges of the bucket. And as you can see, we mixed for a good few minutes and then decided to take a little bit of that epoxy out of the big bucket and just kind of see how it looked, whether or not we needed to add more of the pigment. And for the part that we've all been waiting for, it's finally time to pour the epoxy. Our goal was to try not to pour too much on top of the wood. It did end up getting on the wood, as you can see, and that's totally fine. But if we can eliminate that as much as possible, that's gonna be good, because we need more epoxy under and on the sides of the wood than on top of the wood. Because more than likely, this is not going to cover to the top of these pieces. It's also a good idea to use that mixer to try to move some of the epoxy around the wood and into some of the crevices and the corners, just to make sure that it all gets spaced out evenly. Next thing, if you have a torch, use a torch. We did not have a torch at the time. We do have one now. A lighter works perfectly to get all of those bubbles out. Based on the instructions, we gave that first coat, which was about 1/4 of an inch, about 24 hours to dry, and then began the process of mixing the next layer with the resin and the epoxy that we were going to pour. Basically doing the exact same thing mixing 2 parts resin and 1 part hardener. Again, with the pigment, since we were going for more of an opaque look, it was important to make sure that we got enough of the black in there to keep from it being too transparent. So in other words, you can never add too much of the pigment in this case. And then we went ahead and began pouring for the second layer. And again, guys, it's super easy. Really was not that complicated. Just tried to make sure we got as little on top of the wood as possible because we were ended up shaving that off. And so we want more of that epoxy in the actual mold and the table than on top of the wood.
Alright guys, so we poured the epoxy a couple of days ago. We've let it fully harden and it is now set. Of course we do need to cut off the edges. We know that this is not perfect, but this is just kind of the design.
But we got all the screws out. Now we have to try to get this thing off. I don't even know how, to be honest with you. We've got a crowbar. I'm gonna try not to mess up the table in any way. Obviously I don't want to come here and do that, but it might be.
Might be what we have to do, or maybe even flip it over.
Yeah, I bet that's what we're gonna have to do. Let me flip it over.
Yeah.
All right. So.
Oh gosh.
There it goes. That was easy.
Whoa, okay.
Look at that.
All right.
There's one side of it.
Oh. We thought this was going to be like a long,
yes,
kind of super hard job to do, but all right, I'm impressed, babe. I guess I didn't think about the bottom piece. That might be the hard part to get off.
Possibly. Let me actually get something thinner real quick. Hang on one second.
Okay. Whoa.
Mallet, and then this thing. So, well, let's see if this works.
What is that thing?
This is does it look like I know what it is?
It's a chisel.
Chisel. Okay, if you go back and watch all of our videos, you will find out that I have a very, very hard time articulating things, especially remembering the words for objects. Like, this is a table.
A workbench.
Workbench, right?
I didn't know that about you. Yeah. I learned something new.
Well,
I'm in the
moment. I'm like talking, and then anyways, all right. They don't care about this. They want to watch this.
I might need to come hold it for you. Crowbar. Oh yeah.
Let me flip it back over. This side.
Now try it on the other side.
Oh boy. Oh boy. I think we got it.
Do you need my assistance?
I don't think I need your assistance.
I think you've got it. You're that good. Alright guys.
Look at that.
This is the bottom. It's so shiny, like you can see the reflection. Let me come at it from an angle, you guys. Oh my gosh. This is so cool. This is probably the biggest project we've done, right?
This is definitely the biggest DIY project we've ever done. Outside of the bathroom.
Yes.
That was pretty new, but this one had us scared.
It's really heavy.
Really heavy.
We're gonna cut it down, we're gonna make it smaller. I was so scared that we were gonna mess this up, and we still might mess this up.
So much.
But something that I've learned by doing this is just get up and do it. Because had we not been so afraid of this could have been done a month ago, 2 months ago. You know what I'm saying? Like, if you have an idea, just try. We don't know what we're doing. We're just trying things until they work. If this fails, we're going to do it again. We're going to try it again. So yeah, just figure it out like Justin said. I think this is simply beautiful. The underside is gorgeous. I want to see it again, but I can't lift it up. So Justin, I need you to pick it up for me again.
All right, so that concludes part 1 of doing our first ever epoxy table. The next phase is getting this routered down. As you can tell, some of the wood is still a little bit higher. We only wanted to pour a little bit of epoxy, a certain amount. So stick around for that video. That'll be part 2. This is part 1. And if you want to see that video, that will be that process and then some legs. Make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell. All that good stuff. It's coming.
It's coming for you guys.
Eventually, it will come. So,
we got to get around to doing it.
Yeah.
It's on the way.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. We'll see you guys in part 2 of this video.